Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of Sasanian Speaker Series. Thank you for joining me and Mark, and also a special thanks to the Jordan Center at UCI for funding us, which allows us to bring in and highlight scholars who bring us new approaches and fantastic projects to sort of talk about. I'll hand it off to Mark to introduce today's speaker.
All right, hello, and thank you for joining us, everyone, and thank you, Laya. I'm excited to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kayla Dang, who is the John Renard Professor of Islamic Studies at St. Louis University. Her research engages with a variety of classical languages, including Arabic, Armenian, Greek, Latin, Syriac, and Middle Persian, and focuses upon the history of the Zoroastrian priesthood from the Sasanian to the Islamic period. Today's talk, Sasanian Seals Meet Syriac Martyrs, Reconstructing the Zoroastrian Priesthood in the Sasanian Period, will summarize some of her work on the Sasanian-era Zoroastrian priesthood through the study of two very different types of Sasanian-era sources. So welcome, Dr. Dang.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about my research. Most of this is based on my recent dissertation, and I'll really, kind of give some broad context and then talk about what is really half of a very large project today. So I should probably share my screen. Okay, can you see the presentation view or the?
Yes, no, we can see the presentation view. Perfect.
So everything's good?
Yes.
Okay, so first, I'm going to begin with a very broad overview of what Zoroastrian sources are and what they look like for the study of Zoroastrianism, right? So, to the present day, we have the memorization and recitation of sacred Avestan texts by Zoroastrian priests, the continuation of a very long priestly institution, right? So here you can see two Zoroastrian priests performing the yasna in India. Just special recording. You can visit this project here. But then to go all the way back to when were these texts first composed? Perhaps sometime before 500 BC in oral composition. But how do we fill in this gap in between? This is the biggest question, right? And you can see on the top right here an Avestan manuscript copied in the 17th century. This is one small part of a textual tradition. To get a little more specific, then we have a period of exchange between Indian and Iranian Zoroastrians in the 15th and 18th centuries, to go back a bit in history. That's when a lot of these manuscripts that we actually have today were copied. But to go back further, maybe the oldest possible surviving manuscript is from the 14th or 15th century. But we have colophons that are even earlier. The earliest, we think, from about 1020 CE. So who are the Zoroastrians then? Who are the ones writing manuscripts? Let's keep going back. In the 9th and 10th century, we see the compilation, redaction, composition of what are known as the Zoroastrian Middle Persian or Pahlavi books. So these are Zoroastrians living under Muslim rule in a very different context from a lot of the history of Zoroastrianism previously. So let's go back a little further. We think that maybe in the 6th century was the actual creation of the Avestan alphabet, the writing of the Avesta, and really the collection of Middle Persian commentaries and translations of the Avesta, known as the Zand, and the composition of some of our earliest extant Zoroastrian Middle Persian texts. So what I'm most interested in for the presentation today then is this sort of gap between these two periods here, this sort of rupture, if you will, caused by the Arab conquest of Iran, the end of Sasanian rule, and the beginning of Arab Muslim rule, and how we sort of bridge that gap, and how we then conceive of the Zoroastrian tradition and the priests who copied the texts that are part of that tradition. So here's another look at this sort of chronology, more linearly, if you will. You see different ruling dynasties on the sort of top of this timeline. And then on the bottom, we have what are, traditionally considered Zoroastrian texts, right? In a variety of languages as people who identified as Zoroastrian adopted new languages and began to copy their texts and translate them. But What is often left out of this story or hasn't fully been integrated into this study of Zoroastrianism are the sort of non-Zoroastrian texts and what they have to tell us about Zoroastrianism. And I mean, they're in a variety of languages. Perhaps maybe we spend the most time and attention on these ancient Greek texts and what they tell us about Zarathustra, right? But what I'm interested in, again, that period in the 7th century, the greatest change for the Zoroastrian priests, right around here, right? And so my research focuses on, this swath of texts and traditions covering the centuries from, about maybe 600 to about 1100, and really asking this question about the priesthood as the transmitters of Zoroastrian tradition. If we can know about them, then we can know about what happens to the tradition itself and what we know of Zoroastrianism, even until today, by studying this narrow window here. So let's see. Today, then, what I will spend the most of the rest of the time talking about are two different corpora, like two different bodies of texts and material culture that can really help us study the Sasanian Zoroastrian priesthood. So on the one hand, we have these Sasanian seals and sealings, and then on the other hand are a collection of texts mostly written in Syriac called the Persian Martyr Acts. And they're just part of the literary output from the Sasanian period by, in this case, Christians, but living under Sasanian rule. So these are not technically considered Zoroastrian sources, but they become good evidence for us anyway, because they're contemporary to the Sasanian Zoroastrian priesthood. And then I'm gonna, after giving an overview of both of these corpora of text, I'll speak a little bit of what they look like in comparison to each other. So what are the corroborations between them? And what are the big gaps between them? And what does that tell us about the history of the religion? So let's see. Okay. For Sasanian seals and sealings. Okay. So Sasanian seals and sealings on clay bullae, they're called, they survive in both museum and private collections across the US, Europe, and the Middle East, and some have been excavated from legitimate archaeological expeditions, but more have appeared in private collections, have been confiscated by Iranian authorities as the product of so-called clandestine excavations. And although the provenance of many of the objects in these collections is unknown, those that are actually excavated from Sasanian sites and have been dated with stratigraphy have been dated to the late 6th or early 7th century. So that date is sort of generalized for this whole collection. And this supports the hypothesis that administrative seals didn't really appear before the reforms of Kavad I at the beginning of the 6th century CE. After which much of the Sasanian administrative geography was reorganized. And I can give a quick overview of the sort of types of seals that we tend to see. This is based on some existing scholarship here, but in addition to the wealth of iconographic and material knowledge that these seals and sealings offer for the study of the Sasanian period, the inscriptions on them, it's what I'm mostly interested in, because they preserve the names, titles, and geographic jurisdictions of various officials from the large administrative network of Sasanian Persia. And so far, much of the study of the seals has been focused on their contributions to our knowledge of philology and onomastics on the one hand, and to Sasanian administrative geography on the other. But I focus on something a little bit different. I kind of look at a cross-section of this corpus and really focus on Zoroastrian religious officials, so Zoroastrian priests, and how they are part of Sasanian administration. So the types of seals that we find them on, or across the whole corpus really, are these personal, official, and administrative seals. And the difference between them is it's just a classification, whether they're iconic or not, or have inscriptions or not. But to give an example, sort of like cross look here, on the top, you see what is the administrative seal. In this instance, it's the administration of something called the Magu, which I will talk about briefly, and it tells you where they have jurisdiction. In this case, it's a place called Galul and Khusroshad Kawad. And then on the bottom of this clay bulla, you see a personal seal, in this case of a Mog, or one of the Magi. That's what it would be in the plural, right? In our Anglicization of the word. And so you might find more than one seal impression on a given bullae. And I kind of look at the relationship of the personal seals and the administrative ones, as well as when we have it, the find spot. So there's a lot of information to be gained from these in constructing a sort of network of Zoroastrian priests. And just to give an example of what an official seal look, these would probably be a bit larger than some of the other seals. And here's an example of a couple of mobeds. So these would be Zoroastrian chief priests. But I should probably back up a bit and sort of explain, I included this because sometimes we, at least in this case, we have two sealings that appear in two different private collections that appear to be from the same original seal, even though we don't have that seal anymore, or we have not found it. So that's just an interesting note. But to give a bit of example of what this could have looked like, in most cases, the documents or objects to which these seals were attached no longer survive, but we do have this interesting corpus of text known as the Tabaristan archive, which I put archive in quotations because it was not excavated necessarily, but seems to be a sort of cohesive collection. And here you can see a document written in Middle Persian, and it has a seal still attached to it, a seal with some impressions on it or sealings. And this corpus dates to after the Sasanian period, but it's incredibly important for us to see, the continuation and the transformation of some of these administrative practices from the Sasanian period. But I could talk more about this particular one later, but to sort of back up again, I want to say, okay, so what am I even talking about when I'm talking about Zoroastrian priests and these seals? Well, one prominent scholar, Rika Giselen, has sort of made this division between civil administrations and clerical ones on the other hand. And by clerical, she means, you also see this term, juridico-religious administration. So those are characterized by their association with Zoroastrian magi. And they're associated with Zoroastrian magi, either because it's inherent in the name of these offices or because these are administrative seals that appear together on a bulla, like that one I showed, with a personal seal of a Mog, a Zoroastrian priest. So it's sort of tautological, I guess. They're clerical because they appear with the priest. But it's important to note that this distinction is a heuristic mostly. It's not. It doesn't even bear out all the time in actual practice. There's some overlap of these offices. So for my study, I chose to focus on the offices or administrations that she has termed clerical, which I also call religious, because in order to, if we could reconstruct something like a Zoroastrian institution of the priesthood, this might be a way that we could do it, right? So a lot of my work was collecting these citations through various publications, collecting a lot of information about these clerical offices, right? And so I have a database of over 1,100 entries that includes personal seals or seal impressions of the Magi, official seals and seal impressions of mobeds, administrative seals and seal impressions of other offices like the Magu, the office of the Magi, perhaps, the mobed, the dadwar, which there are very few of, but also this Drioshan, Jadagao, Dadwar, as well as the Handar's bed. Although where he fits into this scheme of things is another matter, but okay. And then based on this information, I'm able to sort of map out this network, and it looks something like this. These are all the provinces for which we have clerical administrations attested, and it really is the full scope of the Sasanian Empire, with the exception of some of these highland regions. And to give an example of how this organization would have looked, we have like the bigger region, and then so in this inset picture here, that would be pars, or otherwise known as fars, right? And then a smaller province underneath that, for instance, Ardashir-Khwara and Bishapur and Stakhar, and then a smaller canton underneath it. And those are attested mostly with those Magu seals administration that I mentioned before. So we have different sort of levels of officials here, hierarchy of officials, if you will, and regional networks that bear out in these sources. So it's just a quick example, just to give what this, just to give an idea of what this looks like, here's the mobed, or the chief priest, and where we find attestations of his jurisdictions. And then what I do is I find all of the references that I can in literary sources and sort of compare this material. So for instance, here's, the Syriac Persian Martyr Acts, which I'll introduce in a moment. But here's what it looks like when I've collected a lot of this information. But a bit of a spoiler alert, there's actually not that much overlap, at least not in the personal identification of any of these individuals. Right? So I'll explain a bit more the significance of that later. But I've also collected these kinds of references in Zoroastrian texts, those traditional, Pahlavi books as well. So for instance, here are some of the mobeds mentioned in the Sasanian law book, right? The Hazar Dadistan. Okay. And the hierarchy that we see in the material corpus has parallels in the literary corpus, but it doesn't match exactly. And I'm going to just preview what that looks like here before talking about the Syriac Persian Martyr Acts a bit more thoroughly. So what are the Syriac Persian Martyr Acts, or Acts of the Persian Martyrs? Well, there's about 60 extant Persian Martyr Acts, mostly written in Syriac, although some in other languages are classified as this. And they're mostly written from the 5th to the 7th century CE. And they describe the martyrdoms of Christians living under Sasanian rule. So these are Persian Christians, but Syriac-speaking Christians, and many who converted from Zoroastrianism to Christianity. And so the audience of these, as well as the subjects of these texts, are often like it's a shared Christian and Zoroastrian context. So part of my project is to argue a bit more for reading these texts as historical sources, even though they are necessarily polemical and antagonistic toward Zoroastrianism. And today I'm going to talk mostly about the life of Mar Ava, but in general, I tend to focus on some of these later Persian martyr acts, which are considered to be a little bit more historically reliable. We actually know who wrote them, some of them in some instances, but they're also written shortly after the events that they narrate. That doesn't mean that they're not problematic in some ways, but they're still good sources for us. And what they tell us, they really describe in ways that material corpus can't. They describe the role and function of Zoroastrian priests as agents of state authority, their interactions with broader Sasanian society, and what they describe is a rigidly hierarchical and bureaucratic judiciary. So to go back to this sort of image of a hierarchy, what really comes from these texts is this picture of, the king is the center of authority, right? But he delegates and acts through his officials and an extensive and hierarchical network of religious and civic bureaucracy, which again, there's some overlap. And this extends from this sort of traveling royal court to the highest regional or provincial officials, and then down to lesser local authorities. And at the top of this religious hierarchy is the Mobedan Mobed, the chief of all chief priests, who you might notice I have not mentioned yet in the material corpus. This is a significant gap that I'll address in a second. But he's sometimes and not always called in the Syriac Rab Magushe, or chief of the Magians. And then below him is this provincial Mobed, who appears in Syriac as the Malpate or Malpata in the singular. And he might also be given an honorific of Great Mobed in the Syriac. And one of his most frequent roles in these texts, right, is he confronts and disputes with Christian martyrs in formal trials and theological debates. And then there's this provincial Rod underneath him, and perhaps the Char d'Adwar sort of fitting up in between, although that's, it's a little more difficult to place him sometimes. But the Rod is a sort of provincial authority, as even a judge, perhaps. And then there's other local judges below him. Okay, but then how does this actually compare? Let's see. Well, just again, to give you a scope of the kinds of titles and things that we find in the Syriac Persian Martyr Acts. These are things taken from the appendices of my dissertation here, where there's much more of this delightful information for you. But in the life of Mar Ava, it's a wonderful example of how these texts can give us titles of officials, some of which do not appear in Zoroastrian literary texts or in the material corpus. So that we have unique instances of some titles for court officials, for instance, if not religious ones, and legal terminology for documents and procedures, and also how those procedures would have looked, like who goes to whom and what that hierarchy is, and how the process works. And we get a hierarchy of religious officials, as I've mentioned, but we also have details about things like the Zoroastrian Adar Gushnas fire complex, which is known in the seals as the Kadagi Adar Gushnas. And these are seals that have been excavated from a site known as Takht Suleiman, which you can see on the map here. And from a narrative like Mar Ava, we get information like, polemical as it is, that he was imprisoned in the province of Azerbaijan, in a district dark with paganism that was called Parishwargar, and in a village named Shiz. And this village happened to be the mother and nursemaid of all Magianism, a site of Magian learning, which he calls the foolish murmuring of Zardosh, son of Spitaman. So this is a common polemic against Zoroastrians, of course, but it also confirms the importance of this site, which really grew as a religious complex in the late Sasanian period. And so, for instance, we get seals from there. There's bullae with seals that have maybe 4 impressions of seals. In this case, one is 3 different magi, 1 mobed sealing. But we also have this interesting seal impression of a Drioshanja de Gao Dadwar from Way Ardashir, which is closer near the capital. So it shows the connection of a site like this to the royal capital, which is also borne out in a text like Mar Ava. So we get more details, is what I'm trying to say. More on the hierarchy of religious officials from a text like this. We see that Ava is imprisoned by a Rad of Azerbaijan. Then there's also a Shar Dadwar, a Rad of Pars that are mentioned in the text, as well as a Mobed of Beth Aramaye. How does this compare? Well, these are regions, some of the sort of broader districts, broader category of geographic jurisdiction. And in the Sasanian seals, we find, well, we actually have officials like this in a lot of these places, but at the provincial level instead. And there seems to be also a change where Azerbaijan becomes a province rather than a broader region as well. So this is just to highlight some of the information that we can get when we compare these sources, and how it does corroborate like where these officials operate and the hierarchy of them. Again, according with some like sort of translation between a Christian view and religious text, which might use more ecclesiastical kind of terminology for some of these places, and how it compares them to Sasanian administrative geography. That there is a lot of overlap is what I'm trying to say, and a lot of corroboration there. But there are also gaps, like for instance, if on the left here we see some of these main titles that appear in the corpus of Sasanian seals. On the right you see, or in the middle you see the Syriac Martyr Acts and what they tell us, and on the far right the Zoroastrian Middle Persian books. Now the Mobedan Mobed is this chief of all priests that figures prominently in both of these texts, the literary sources on the right. He is nowhere in the corpus of Sasanian seals. So we have to wonder, not that he didn't exist, but what was his function, like administratively or not? Was a Mobed then sort of deputized to be a Mobedan Mobed, and how that relationship works, we don't know. Additionally, the Rad, who does appear as some sort of administrative, judicial, figure in literary sources, does not appear in the corpus of Sasanian seals. Again, not to say that he didn't exist, but what do these gaps mean? Well, I think they highlight how fragmentary all of these sources are. None of them is complete. We must look at them all together in order to get the best possible picture. We have no single source, no single body of sources, and no single source itself that will give us all of this information and lay it out for us all on its own. But most interestingly to me is that we have this office that is, appears overwhelmingly in the corpus of Sasanian seals, the Magu, which has a contested name and meaning, which I won't get into now. But this is an office that is nowhere attested in the extant literary record, whether that's the Zoroastrian texts or non-Zoroastrian texts. Now, we do have various groupings of magi, especially in the Syriac Persian martyr acts, that they call or they convene maybe hearings and things like. If anything comes close to being a sort of council of the magi, we might find it in the Syriac martyr acts, but no one is able to really pinpoint this in Zoroastrian text, which is interesting. On the other hand, we have a bunch of other priestly titles that appear in Zoroastrian texts down here on the bottom right, that do not feature in these Syriac or other non-Zoroastrian accounts so much, or in the corpus of Sasanian seals. So that means that these priests were not administrative officials. We know, in fact, that they had a lot to do with ritual practice or priestly education, right? But they do not feature in these other corpora. So sources from the Islamic period, for instance, show that the Herbed, this priestly teacher, he developed into a community leader of sorts, in charge of judicial matters and handling the affairs of the community, with these new rulers and conquerors. And these are the kinds of shifts we need to pay attention to. So rather than attempting to conflate the role and function of all of these offices in the Sasanian period with that of the early Islamic period, we have to separate out what each corpus of sources is actually telling us and when it applies. And it may be that we can't develop a working model that includes all of the known Zoroastrian religious authorities from the Sasanian period. And maybe there's a reason for that. And I think this relates to the transmission of the religion and perhaps how our understanding of it needs to change a little bit more, rather than assuming a level of continuity, rather than assuming this level of continuity that comes from the Zoroastrian sources and this tradition about the inheritance of the legacy of the past. I think we need to interrogate it a little bit more and question who are the priests and where. So I have another slide that sort of compares the Sasanian provinces, attested in the material corpus, that would be all the black here, with the sort of centers of Zoroastrian learning as we know them from the Islamic period in red. So it'd be like Isfahan, Yazd, Kerman, Sistan. Now these are sites that do not really feature in the material corpus as we know it. Now that on the one hand shows how fragmentary that corpus is, but on the other hand, it suggests a disconnect between the sort of types of priests, perhaps, or the families of priests that are preserving the Zoroastrian tradition. It's perhaps a more selective transmission of the religion rather than a representative one, if you see what I mean. So this is something that I think needs to be interrogated a little bit more, especially as we know of the great variety of Zoroastrianisms in the post-Sasanian period. We need to extrapolate that back to the Sasanian period as well, and really complicate this picture and complicate the narrative. Now, this is part of my larger project in which I sort of pursue the Zoroastrian priesthood as an institution into the Islamic period. And I do that by looking at Arabic sources as well as the Middle Persian ones. And to go back, the office that carries through all of these types of sources and really into the Arabic ones as well is the Mobed, that chief priest. And he sort of becomes the locus of a lot of this, the tradition. So if you want to follow my research going forward, I'll be tracing the Mobed in Arabic sources in the Islamic period and seeing how he's truly a part of Islamic society in preserving the Zoroastrian tradition. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Kayla. This was such a wonderful talk, and in particular, the great timelines and the charts were very clarifying, I think, for a lot of people that potentially have some basic understanding of the subject. And it really, for me, it really resonated and put things into perspective. One of the things that I'm very fascinated as I am doing a database myself is, are you still collecting, and or you're sort of done with the collection? And another thing with the sort of collection is the sort of onomastics and the nishans that I'm interested. Do you see a lot of repetition? Are you collecting? These sort of priestly classes have a lot of nishans associated with them? Nishans meaning the sort of symbols.
So I have notes about these symbols, and I have attempted a very basic, like when I find similar names, whether that's in these names appear, and there's a first name and then there's a so-called patronymic. And I have a lot of thoughts about the patronymic, the second part of the name, and if that's what it is actually. But in any case, when I see similarities between those or across different names, I try to compare based on my notes again, what those images, what the iconography looks like. And I'm not an art historian, not the best person for this job, but it's just a basic analysis. I have not found very many, if any, like significant overlaps. Although there are like some I have, statistics about certain names that appear so many. I mean, anything with the name Ador, right, is going to appear so many times, meaning fire, right, for a priest. So I've collected all of these things. I'm still figuring out what to do with this information, and I am still adding to it when there are new publications. I'm almost entirely dependent upon other scholars publishing this work because I don't have access to the actual, the objects in most cases. Now there are a lot of objects and documents in the Berkeley archive. I don't know how many of them have to do with priests because many of them haven't even been looked at yet. I'm assuming not very, but it would be strange if there weren't any. I guess it depends on where these came from. We don't know a lot. So that would be another project to take on, right? Is to, with other scholars, actually look at these objects and publish them. And then to digitize what we already have based on other publications. So these are all goals of mine. What I can accomplish in the next few years while also attempting to write a book about a completely different subject, like I said, on the Islamic period, remains to be seen, but it's something that I hope to continue with.
Well, we look forward to it. And for me, speaking of repetition, it was very interesting to see that seal that you showed, that you find the same impression of one particular seal twice. Have you seen that? Is that one of the only ones that you've come across?
I mean, I'm thinking, as far as I know, that's one of the only ones that appears across collections, right? Now in excavated archives, like Takht Suleiman or Qasr Abu Nasr, there are like repeating personal seals, as well as administrative ones. That's common as well. But there are a handful of repeating personal seals, but they tend to be within the same excavated collection. Yeah, but I'm going to keep a lookout for that.
Please do. Mark, any comments, questions?
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask a generalist question for our audience. You mentioned early on, Kayla, Sanskrit editions of the Avesta. Could you speak about that? Because that's something I've never known to think about.
Yeah, if I could go back and show my slide. I mean, it's not something that I know a whole lot about, to be honest, but it has to do with the community of Zoroastrians that migrated to India, right? Some of the earliest translations of some of these Middle Persian texts, but also Avestan texts, I believe, were into Sanskrit by priests, I think I don't want to be wrong here, but maybe as early as the 13th century, I want to say. And then Gujarati became more common, but they're writing in Persian as well. So there's a whole mix of these things. But yes, they're translating Zoroastrian texts into Sanskrit.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Now going from a very generalist question to a much more specific question. So following Rika Gazellan's sort of typology of clerical administration, you mentioned reading the Ostandar as a clerical administrative title.
Did I?
it was on the slide, and I was like, oh, well, let's talk about that, because I should give the background. Is like one of the source corpuses that I look at a lot, or have been looking at a lot and look at for my dissertation research, are the Golem documents in the Berkeley Berlin Pahlavi Archive. And we have the Ostandar is an office that occurs particularly in reference to the estate manager Poiren. So I was like, oh, this is fascinating. Let's ask about Ostandars, and do we see seals of the Ostandars? How might they fit into a clerical administration?
So they're strictly speaking part of the civil administration.
Okay, civil administration.
So, but now I'm searching through my dissertation right now as we speak, actually, because this is a problem of my research, right? That as I focused on the clerical administrations, I ignored a lot about the civil ones, for the purposes of writing a dissertation, right? As we all do. But so there are, it was massive anyway, right? But there's, I do now wish that I'd collected all of the same information about those civil administrations, because I think it would be interesting to look at the iconography. Again, as an art historian, that would be more of someone else's alley, not mine. But yes, there are lots of seals. I don't know, lots is the number for the Ostandar. But for me, it's interesting because he also appears in these Persian martyr acts, and within the same family in one instance as mobeds and other religious officials. So, I mean, in literary sources, we see the overlap of these administrations, but then in the seals themselves, I think the overlap appears mostly with the Shahrab, that official, that I think, I don't want to say something that's incorrect, but I believe it's a Shahrab seal that has a clerical personal seal on it as well. But I mean, it happens so rarely. But on the other hand, when we have these regional archives that I talked about, whether they're excavated or we just happen to have a bunch of seals with toponyms from the same region, we see both kinds of offices appearing together. And when that's in an excavated archive, that's significant. Now, maybe not something like the Adari Gushnasp fire complex, like Takti Suleiman, I think is mostly clerical seals. But again, I'd have to go back and look again. But it does happen. And so we need to ask, like, okay, what are these archives even? I wish we could know this information, but without, for the Sasanian material, unfortunately, we don't have the documents, right? We don't have the objects to which these seals were attached for the most part. So, sorry, Ted.
Oh, no, thank you. That's great. Laya, do you want to ask another question? And then I have sort of one final
thing about sort of the martyr acts and seeing them as historical. I was wondering if you can sort of elaborate on that, and sort of where do you see your project sort of veering off from scholarship and taking advantage of the material that they provide?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So it's something I struggled with, how far to trust these sources, right? And it's a pendulum swing in scholarship as well, from taking everything verbatim, as some of the early 20th century, 19th century scholars did, to distrusting them completely because they are so polemical. But there are a handful of scholars, and again, they're coming from the fields of Iranian studies, so perhaps more interested in doing this, right? Is in reading them, particularly for what I call the incidental information, right? Things that are not actually part of the polemic, but they fill in the narrative, right? There's, and they give the effect of the real, or perhaps are providing accurate details. Now, maybe not in the names of some of these officials, because there is actually no overlap, at all, that I can tell from the corpus that I've collected of material sources and the literary ones, but the titles, right? And the toponyms, like the geographic jurisdictions of some of these officials. And again, allowing for some, change in terminology from, again, what is mostly like a Christian, church structure. But there's some debate about how that is mapped onto the Sasanian administrative geography anyway, but because there's a lot of overlap. So other scholars are already looking at these sources, like I said, for information about onomastics, if not actual people, then how Iranian names are, and what names existed, as well as place names, right? Toponyms. so I'm sort of taking it a bit further, and then and more seriously considering some of the judicial aspects of them. Now, it's other scholars of Sasanian law have looked at them in this regard, but my focus on the priesthood is a little bit unique in a way there. And I'm also planning like another paper where I can explore this a bit more. I didn't make it into the dissertation, but again, fully appreciating the shared cultural context of Christians and Zoroastrians under Sasanian rule. Again, like someone like Richard Payne in A State of Mixture has so expertly displayed this for us, but it's something I that I think deserves closer attention. And so I would like to look at these martyr acts for like specifically how these Christians are playing with Zoroastrian ritual. There's a lot that they tell us about Zoroastrian cosmology and ritual practice that is, again, often the focus of polemic, but that doesn't mean that it's completely off base. Sometimes we have exact like corroborations from Zoroastrian texts, and when we don't necessarily need to throw it out as polemic. We could say, there's a lot of variety, again, of Zoroastrian practice within the Sasanian period. So let's
that's so true.
closer.
There's a sort of an underlining of a cultural history just lying there that to be explored, I think.
And it's just to add, I mean, just truly amazing. I mean, at least in like one cycle of Acts that I didn't talk about today, but the Pethion cycle, there's so much vocabulary, like religious vocabulary, some of it unattested elsewhere in extant Zoroastrian sources that, again, deserves a much closer look.
That's amazing. That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I wish you sort of all the best, and we look forward to your following publications and your book. And thank you again for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.